Angie Dodge was born on December 21, 1977, in Washington State. She was the youngest of her parents' 4 children, and their only daughter. She loved Christmas because it was just a few days after her birthday, and every year, both the holiday and her birthday would be celebrated with a large family party. The family moved to San Diego before finally settling in Idaho Falls, Idaho. Angie had a love for the outdoors, and going camping with her family was one of her favorite things to do. Angie excelled academically and was a tutor in math and English while she was a student at Idaho Falls High School. She graduated from the school in 1995 and briefly attended Idaho State University. While Angie was very close with her family, like many young adults, she struggled with balancing her love for them with her growing need for independence. In May of 1996, the 18-year-old decided to move out of her family home after a disagreement over her breaking a house rule. Angie worked at a local beauty supply store, and her income allowed her to rent an apartment on the 2nd floor of a converted house in the 400 block of I Street in Idaho Falls. At 9:15 p.m. on June 12, 1996, 3 weeks after she moved out, Angie came back home to see her mother, Carol. They sat on the couch and talked about how excited Angie was about being on her own, but also how difficult it was to be growing up. Angie rested her head on her mother's shoulder, and Carol told her that she would always be her baby. Angie left around 10:20. Carol watched her leave, and as Angie drove away, she and Carol blew kisses to each other and mouthed, "I love you." This would be the last time Carol saw her daughter. The following morning, June 13th, Angie failed to show up to work, which was highly unusual. Her coworkers were worried about her, and one of them went to her apartment to check on her. They arrived just after 11 a.m. and entered Angie's apartment through its unlocked front door. They found Angie's body on the floor of her bedroom. She had been stabbed multiple times, and her throat had been slashed. Angie had also been raped, and semen and foreign hairs were found on her body. DNA testing showed that they came from the same individual. While the DNA evidence could be used to prove a suspect's involvement in the crime, the Idaho Falls police first needed a suspect to compare it to, and for several months, they could not identify a promising one. Then, in January of 1997, an acquaintance of Angie's named Brian Hobbs was charged with raping a woman at knife point in Nevada. Because of his connection to Angie and the details of this crime, police in Idaho Falls began looking at Brian Hobbs as a potential suspect while he was still in custody in Nevada. As part of their investigation, they began questioning numerous friends and associates of Dobbs in Idaho. One of these individuals was a man named Christopher Tapp. Chris Tapp was 20 years old and a high school dropout. When he came in to speak to police and provide a DNA sample, he denied having any knowledge of the crime or playing any part in it. However, after being polygraphed 7 times and interrogated 9 times for a total of 28 hours over the course of 23 days, Christopher confessed to being involved in Angie's murder. He was charged in the case in February of 1997. Despite his confession, Christopher Tapp pled not guilty to Angie's rape and murder, and his trial began on May 2, 1998. His DNA did not match that found at the crime scene, and no physical evidence tied him to the crime. A witness, Destiny Osborne, testified at the trial that she had heard Tapp and Brian Hobbs discussing Angie's murder at a party several days after it occurred, while she was high on methamphetamine. The prosecution's main evidence against Tapp was his confession. On May 28, 1998, after 13 hours of deliberation, the jury found Christopher Tapp guilty of first-degree murder and rape. Because he had confessed, and would not have been convicted without that confession, the judge at his sentencing hearing sentenced Tapp to life in prison with a 30-year minimum term, rather than imposing the death penalty, as Carol Dodge had requested. While there had been a conviction in Angie's case, it was still not completely solved. Because the DNA found on Angie's body did not belong to Christopher Tapp, prosecutors argued that at least one other person had been involved in Angie's rape and murder. Carol Dodge was determined to bring this other individual to justice. She did not believe Tapp's claims of his innocence and did everything she could to get him to reveal the identity of the person whose DNA was left at the crime scene. She visited him in prison and begged him to tell her daughter's last words and the identity of the other man involved. She was livid when he told her he did not know. Carol spent years focused on the task of getting justice for her daughter, reviewing documents, questioning Angie's neighbors, and investigating every detail of the case on her own. However, the specifics of that mission did eventually change slightly, many years after Christopher Tapp's conviction. While she had originally been confident in Tapp's guilt in the crime, she changed her mind after finally gaining access to the recordings of his interviews and polygraphs. Tapp had originally vehemently denied knowing anything about the crime. He would eventually provide police with 6 different stories about what happened to Angie, based on information they provided him. He did not understand that the police could lie to him, so when they told him they had absolute proof that Brian Hobbs was involved, which they did not, Tapp told them that Hobbs had confessed to him and asked him to be his alibi. After a series of immunity agreements began coming into play, under which Tapp would only have to plead guilty to aiding and abetting an aggravated battery, police got him to say that he had been at Angie's apartment and witnessed the crime. Police ran into a problem, however, when the results from the DNA tests on Tapp and Hobbs came in. Neither man was a match to the DNA at the crime scene. They then suggested to Tapp that another one of his friends, Jeremy Sargis, had been involved in the crime. Tapp now said that he had witnessed Sargis and Hobbs commit the rape and murder. When Sargis's DNA was tested, it was also not a match to the crime scene DNA, and police were able to confirm his alibi for the night of Angie's murder. They then voided Tapp's immunity agreements. In Tapp's final story, the one presented at trial, he said he held Angie down by the wrists during her assault and made some of the cuts found on her body. Hobbs and another man he could not identify beyond the first name of Mike were the other participants. Hobbs was never charged in the case. The tapes of the interrogation show Tapp being intimidated and fed information, but it was really the tapes of the polygraph examinations that made Carol understand why Tapp would make a false confession. A polygraph expert would later say that the test was used as a psychological rubber hose against Tapp. Michael Heavey, a retired Superior Court judge from Washington State, who would eventually work on Tapp's case through the group Judges for Justice, argues that the detectives involved broke the rules that surround the administration of polygraph examinations, likely because they did not believe anyone would ever watch the tapes of the exams, as polygraph results are not admissible in court. Judge Heavey argues that rather than use the exams to determine Tapp's credibility, as they are intended, the authorities in this case used them to brainwash Christopher Tapp and trick him into providing false testimony. During one of his polygraph exams, Tapp is threatened with dying in the gas chamber. Threats are not to be used in these situations, specifically because they can lead to false confessions. The administrators of the test also convinced Tapp that the machine was telling them that he was lying when he said he was not involved in the crime, and that it was infallible. He must have suppressed the memory of the murder, because the machine could read his subconscious, and it said that he was involved. Tapp at one point asks the administrator if he had committed the crime. Tapp was provided with details of the crime and suggested answers to the questions he was being asked. When Tapp finally said he had stabbed Angie during the polygraph, one of the police officers in the room came over and shook his hand. Tapp was told he had passed the test by providing this answer, but the report from this polygraph shows that he was actually being deceptive when he said he had stabbed Angie. Carol Dodge was convinced of Tapp's innocence and believed that the just thing to do would be release him from prison. The woman who had previously asked for Tapp to receive the death penalty now became one of his biggest advocates. She contacted Stephen Drizin, a professor at Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law and a leading expert in false confessions, asking for his help in Tapp's case. He was familiar with the case because he had been talking to Tapp's legal team for over a year, and he agreed to work on it pro bono after speaking with Carol. His 2014 report found that Tapp's confession had been coerced and was the product of deceit and pressure from the authorities, who had then provided Tapp with enough details about the crime and the crime scene to make the confession seem credible. Tapp's case received the attention of and help from several organizations over the years. In addition to Judges for Justice, The Idaho Innocence Project took on the case in 2007, and the Innocence Project of New York also did work on the case. This help was invaluable, because Tapp's legal battle to prove his innocence and overturn his conviction had not been going well. Following his 2001 appeal, the Idaho Court of Appeals had ruled that Tapp's Miranda rights had been violated during many of his interviews with police, but that these violations were harmless. His appeals and petitions for post-conviction relief, which his mother, Vera, had mortgaged her home and spent years working 2 jobs to pay the legal fees for, all failed. The videos of the interrogations and polygraphs, as well as new DNA evidence, gave Tapp new hope. In his final story to police, Tapp had said that he had held Angie down by the wrists during her attack. Angie's hands had been swabbed as a part of the initial investigation, but those samples were never tested, even after prosecutors went to court to argue that Tapp had touched her specifically on that part of her body. They were finally tested in 2016, and only found Angie's DNA and that of the person whose semen had been found on her. Further testing of other objects from the scene, such as Angie's blanket and a blood-stained teddy bear, also failed to find Tapp's DNA. Destiny Osborne, who had testified against Tapp at his trial, also recanted her testimony in 2017. She claimed that, like Tapp's confession, her testimony had been coerced by police, who threatened her with drug charges after her release from the Behavioral Health Center, where she had been held on an unrelated offense. "I was manipulated and coerced and fed a huge story and threatened 23 years ago by the many members of the Idaho Falls Police Department to falsely testify against Chris Tapp," Osborne told the Idaho Falls Post-Register in 2019. In the fall of 2016, Christopher Tapp's lawyers met with Bonneville County prosecuting attorney Daniel Clark. Rather than pursue Tapp's 2 pending appeals, Clark agreed to drop Tapp's rape conviction. The murder conviction would still stand, but Tapp would be allowed to leave prison, having served 20 years. Christopher Tapp was not quick to agree to these terms. He still maintained his innocence, and did not want the murder conviction to stay on his record. However, in March of 2017, he agreed to the terms. "I took the lesser of 2 evils," he later told the Idaho Statesman. "I've been fighting this for 20 years. When you lose so many hearings and lose so many battles, you continue to lose faith in the justice system." Carol Dodge and her son Brent Dodge were present at and spoke during Tapp's release hearing. "Chris, the day we were here and chose your jury, the jury that convicted you, little did we know what we know now," Carol said. "For 13 years, I was really angry at you, and of course, you were angry at me. I had a hardened heart because for 13 years they programmed my mind to believe you were part of my daughter's killing." While Brent and Carol did not believe Tapp was involved in Angie's murder, they were glad that a way to have him released had been found, even if he had not been fully exonerated. "Although the agreement is not perfect, it does provide the catalyst by which healing can take place," Brent said to the court. "So, Your Honor, on behalf of our family and Angie, we absolutely recommend Chris be set free. Absolutely." On March 22, 2017, Christopher Tapp left the Bonneville County Courthouse after the release hearing as a free man. That same day, he visited the grave of his father, who passed away while Chris was incarcerated, for the first time. While prosecutor Daniel Clark accepted the deal that set Chris Tapp free, he did not necessarily accept the notion that Chris Tapp was innocent. In July of 2015, facing pressure from the various advocacy groups working on Tapp's case, he commissioned an independent investigation into it. The investigation came to an end in the fall of 2016, and Clark maintains that it did not uncover any new, credible, and material evidence that Tapp is innocent. In a formal statement released the same day Tapp was released from custody, Clark said, "To be clear, there is not sufficient evidence to prove Tapp is innocent, which is the proper legal question at this time." He would later describe the deal to the Idaho Statesman as a means to an end. While Carol Dodge's advocacy had helped secure Chris Tapp's freedom, her work was not yet finished. He had not yet been exonerated, and Angie's real killer had not been brought to justice. Carol focused on the main piece of evidence in the case, the DNA, believing it would be what would finally identify the man who had killed her daughter. Even before Chris Tapp was released from prison, the Idaho Falls police had been looking into using new DNA techniques to identify the man whose semen and hair had been left on Angie's body. In 2014, they used a public genealogy database to attempt to identify the killer. They looked at a public genealogy database that had originally been developed by the Sorensen Molecular Genealogy Foundation, but had since been acquired by Ancestry.com. After they were compelled to provide information to the police by a warrant, Ancestry.com implemented protections to ensure that they would not have to do so in the future. Authorities used Y chromosome analysis to search the database and look for a match to the DNA from the crime scene. They found a man in the database who was a close but not identical match to the DNA at the crime scene. That man was Michael Usry Sr., who had submitted his DNA to the database as part of a genealogy project at his local church. Since he was not a perfect match, authorities began looking at his male relatives. Usry had a son, Michael Jr., who was a filmmaker living in Louisiana. He had been 17 at the time of Angie's murder and had briefly visited Idaho in 1996. Police in Idaho Falls obtained a search warrant, compelling him to provide a DNA sample. Michael was also interviewed about the case and denied any involvement in it. His DNA was not a match to the DNA from the crime scene, and he was cleared. The effort had not solved the case. Carol Dodge, however, was not ready to give up on the idea of using DNA or genealogy databases to identify Angie's killer. In November of 2018, the crime scene DNA was sent to Parabon Nanolabs. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore originally did not believe that she and her team could be of service in the case. The DNA had degraded over the years and was just barely within the range of what Moore was willing to work with. However, Carol Dodge then called her and convinced her to take on Angie's case. Moore submitted the DNA profile to GEDmatch, which allowed her to compare its autosomal DNA to the samples in the database. The 2014 effort had only examined and compared DNA on the Y chromosome. When the team from Parabon submitted their findings to the Idaho Falls Police Department in early 2019, they had identified 6 potential suspects who were distantly related to the Usry family police had looked at in 2014. DNA samples were surreptitiously collected from these men, and they were eliminated. Furthermore, analysis of their DNA found that they were not closely related to Angie's killer. C.C. Moore realized that there must be an unidentified member of the family tree she was missing. She eventually turned her attention to a young woman who had married into the family at a young age. That marriage ended in divorce, and the woman later remarried. While she did not appear to have a child during her first marriage, she gave birth shortly after it ended, but the child grew up with his stepfather's surname, which was why he had not been identified as a member of the family originally. Moore and her team were able to locate the woman's mother's obituary with the help of a small local library, and it listed her daughter with her new last name and the names of her children. The new potential suspect was named Brian Drips, and there was a 53-year-old man with that name currently living in Caldwell, Idaho. Police from Idaho Falls traveled to Caldwell to surveil Drips and hopefully collect an item he discarded that would have his DNA on it. Drips was a smoker, and police were eventually able to collect a cigarette butt they saw him discard. When the DNA on that cigarette butt was analyzed, it was found to be a match to the DNA found on Angie Dodge's body. On May 15, 2019, Brian Drips was brought in for questioning. He originally denied any involvement in the case, but once he was informed that his DNA had been matched to the DNA found at the crime scene, he confessed to both the rape and murder. Drips had lived across the street from Angie and had been interviewed by police about her murder just days after her death as part of the neighborhood canvass. During his confession, he claimed that he had entered Angie's apartment with the intention of raping her, but had not planned on killing her. He also said that he had acted alone and did not know Christopher Tapp. Following his confession, Drips was arrested and charged with Angie's rape and murder. At the press conference announcing Drips' arrest, Idaho Falls Police Chief Bryce Johnson acknowledged the role that Carol Dodge played in keeping Angie's case alive. Carol inspired us all to try harder and do better, he said. Carol, for 23 years, every day, every second of every day, She's been looking out for her daughter. This case begins and ends with Carol. On July 11, 2019, prosecuting attorney Daniel Clark filed a motion requesting that the court vacate Christopher Tapp's murder conviction. There exists clear and convincing evidence that Tapp was convicted of a crime he did not commit, Clark wrote in the filing. Therefore, the state moves that the court grant post-conviction relief, set aside the jury verdict, and vacate the judgment of conviction, and dismiss the case. On July 17th, Chris Tapp was in court for a hearing in the matter. Judge Alan Stevens approved the motion and told Tapp, "As far as the court is concerned, you are cleared of the charges you have been living under for the past 20-plus years." Christopher Tapp became the first person to ever be exonerated with the use of genetic genealogy. Carol Dodge was in court to see his name finally be cleared. Chris was able to find work after his release from prison and was working at a plastic bag factory at the time of his exoneration. His opportunities had been limited due to the murder conviction on his record, but his exoneration eliminates that problem. He is relieved to have finally restored his family's good name for his mother. In December 2019, he filed suit against the Idaho Falls Police Department and several individual detectives and officers, seeking damages for false imprisonment and arrest, malicious prosecution, defamation, libel, negligence, and emotional harm and distress. Brian Dripps remains in custody, awaiting his trial, which is currently set to begin on June 8, 2021. His lawyer is currently petitioning for his confession to be thrown out, and for a change of venue, due to local media coverage of the case. Carol Dodge is frustrated by the long wait for the trial, and worried she will be unable to make the frequent trips to another part of the state for the trial and other hearings related to the case. Angie's case is just as well known over there as it is here, she pointed out. Despite the challenges she has faced and the twists and turns the case has taken over the past 2 decades, Carol remains just as committed as ever to making sure that justice is served in Angie's case.